The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Today's topic is workforce planning, and we have Professor Nigel Wilson, who sort of is the father of the Transit Lab here at MIT and of this course. He's sort of the master of everything related to transit and applications of transit data to operations, planning, and strategy. You may remember that we divided the course into themes, and so we already talked about crew scheduling in the context of operations planning, and now we're in the strategy and policy theme. So this lecture is on looking again at crews and planning, but from a strategic perspective. I think that's
great.
Enough of an introduction. Maybe you can
Yeah.
a little more.
Thank you, Gabrielle. It's good to see a fair number of familiar faces and some new ones I don't know yet. So I encourage you all to jump in and ask questions if I'm not making things clear or if you disagree or whatever. But I'm delighted to be here with you today. So the work that I'm going to be discussing is work that I haven't done recently. It's about workforce planning, and it was done with the MBTA, principally the results I'll give are for the MBTA, as it existed 20-odd years ago. But the issues are exactly the same then as they are now. In fact, I gave a summary of this presentation to the MBTA, Brian Shortsleeve and some of the other people at the MBTA a year and a half ago or so, and they were thinking about maybe they really should think something like this again. So what I want to discuss the problem in general, the approach that we've taken to this, and then look at three different levels of the problem. One is the strategic level, which is the long-term view, which fits in with Gabrielle's statement about the theme of this part of the course being on strategy. Then the tactical level, which is shorter range, and then the operational level, which is really short range. And these are all tightly connected and interrelated, as I hope I'll be able to explain to you. Okay, so the challenge that we have in this part of the operations planning process, if you think of it that way, is we want to provide good service. We've got hopefully a decent operating plan that we've developed, and we want to make sure that the service that's delivered is reliable. That requires decent equipment, decent infrastructure, and also a workforce that's motivated and there when you need them, which is pretty much every day. So the operations plan, you've all been through this at this stage in the course, so you know what goes into the operations plan. So what comes out of the operations plan are a set of schedules, timetables, runs, or duties for operators to perform. And that requires a certain amount of workforce. So, excuse me for using the term manpower, but it's sort of the workforce that we need. So if you don't have the right level of workforce available on a particular day or at a particular time on that day, then you've got a problem potentially. If you can buy work on an overtime basis, you can do that and at least not drop any trips. That's going to cost you money, though. And you may not be able to get the overtime, which will, again, produce unreliable service through drop trips. It may also, if some workers in the workforce feel that they can rely on overtime, which gives them a 50% premium rate, they maybe can take more absence time. So there's a substitution relationship here between absence and overtime. So if you rely more heavily on overtime, perhaps your absence rate will go up. That's not an outcome you want. So you've got to be very careful about that. Certainly, if you can't buy the overtime and you don't have enough people on the property that particular day, that particular time, then you're going to drop trips because you don't have anyone to run the bus or run the train, and that's a problem because that produces worse service reliability, worse customer satisfaction. Politically, it's a very negative feedback loop as well. And so workforce planning is actually a fairly critical piece of getting from the operations plan to good service on the street or on the rails. This is sort of a high-level view of what the problem is as I see it. So on the left of this chart, you have the operator availability. That means the number of drivers you have available on a particular day. That's affected by the number of people, of operators you had available the previous day. If you hired people, how many people are coming on to the increase the supply, what sort of attrition, what sort of outflow do you have from your workforce from your previous day or time period? What's the absence, because those guys aren't going to be there, those people aren't going to be there to deliver service. And of course, you have a roster. You say everyone typically works 5 days and takes 2 days off, and that rotates among the workforce. So this is the supply side in terms of the operator. On the demand side, you have the scheduled service, which is the result of your operating plan, what you want to provide. You have unscheduled service additions, and you potentially have unscheduled service deletions. For instance, if there's a school vacation, you will drop some school trips, so trips which are primarily there on high-frequency routes to provide school service. And these don't fit naturally into the timetable process because there's a lot of overhead in developing a timetable, as I'm sure Gabrielle has explained to you. So you'll just take those trips out off the table that day, and those operators are then available to provide other service that you need and to fill in for absent operators those days. So you've got the supply, you've got the demand, and so you're down here looking at the availability versus the supply of drivers. I'll call them drivers. The technical jargon in the industry is operators. In a perfect world, you'd have an exact balance between availability and demand, and you have no additional cost, and you've got someone to cover every trip. That will never happen. Why? Because the operator availability is stochastic. It's uncertain. You don't know what the absence rate is going to be tomorrow. With the best will in the world, with the best models in the world, you don't know whether I'm going to be feeling well enough to work tomorrow. So that's a problem. And you don't know, for instance, in the MBTA, you don't know if you're going to have a failure on the red line. You're going to have to bus parts of the red line tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning. Okay? So all of those uncertainties affect this balance between the availability and demand. So you'll never be here. I mean, statistically, it's virtually certain you'll never be there. You're either going to be over here, where the availability is less than demand. In that case, you have additional overtime costs because you're going to have to try and buy operators to work that overtime. And perhaps more seriously, you have the risk of dropping trips if you can't persuade operators that they should work the overtime that day. Or you're over here where the availability is greater than demand. In that case, you have additional personnel costs who aren't going to be used as productively as you might like. If they were going to be used productively, you'd have built them into the operating plan. So they're probably not going to be used as productively as your average operator. So this is sort of one way of looking at the framework. We can think of, again, 3 levels of planning here. At the strategic level, this is typically looking at a 1-year or even longer than 1-year horizon. So it's not strategic in terms of infrastructure, it's strategic in terms of operations. So that's how many people will we need in the driver workforce over the next 12 months? And how do we get a hiring plan that will give us the right number of people throughout the year? How do we allocate our vacations? We have a certain vacation liability. If I'm a 20-year employee of the MBTA in the Carmen's Union, I probably have about 5 weeks vacation time over the year. So I get my 5 weeks, but the MBTA management decisions include when to provide the vacation allocation. So you may have an overall vacation liability of 2,000 vacation weeks. So the question at the strategic level, how do you allocate those 2,000 weeks of vacation liability over the course of the year? And there are good ways of doing that. There are bad ways of doing that. I mean, if you give vacation liability when people don't want to take vacations, what's likely to happen? Your absence rate's going to increase. So you really want to give vacations when people want to take vacations. But you don't want to give them so much vacation when they want to take vacation that it really costs you a lot more money. In that case, maybe taking higher absence will be a better way of dealing with that. So there are really important questions on how to meet the vacation liability. And this is the timetable. We've decided what we need in terms of providing decent service. And then at the strategic level, I'd also include personnel policies. So as I think you all know, in many agencies, including the MBTA, you have a mix of part-timers and full-timers. In the MBTA, you have Management Rights Act, which I'm sure you've heard about. Maybe Fred will talk about that next week. It's a very interesting topic, and Fred will make a meal of it. I guarantee that. So the MBTA management was given these rights by the legislature 36 years ago. And so they cannot negotiate about not using part-timers. That's not part of the contract negotiation. That's a right they've been given by legally. It's been challenged in the courts, it's been upheld, and so they will use part-timers. They've decided to use part-timers in a way that I think is very unproductive. They use part-timers as apprentice full-timers. And so someone suffers through perhaps 5 years as a part-timer at the MBTA in order to reach nirvana of being a full-timer at the MBTA. Well, that's one way of doing it, but I'm not sure that's the best way of doing it. Perhaps what you're doing is you're making these part-timers suffer for 5 years, if that's how long it takes to get promoted from part-time to full-time status. So they're sort of unhappy for that 5 years because that's not what they want. And it's pretty miserable working conditions. They don't get full benefits, and typically they work a 6-hour day spread over 13 hours. They're covering the AM peak and the PM peak, and they're doing nothing between the AM peak and PM peak. You hope they're not in bars, but they're certainly not doing anything productive with property. So that's the way the MBTA decided to use the management rights they were given by the legislature. I don't think that was a good decision. If you have separate AM part-timers, might you be able to increase your workforce? I think so. You have people, shop clerks, who don't really start work until after the AM peak, who might be very interested in supplementing their shop clerk job by having an AM peak driving job. And similarly, in the PM peak, you probably can increase your labor pool with people who are not interested in a full-time MBTA driver's job, but they would be interested in just a sort of a guaranteed 3-hour piece of work every day. So there are lots of different ways of implementing this. I'm pretty sure the MBTA didn't do it optimally. So that's what I mean by personnel policies. So all of these are at the strategic level. At the tactical level, what we're making decisions on is the time horizon is typically one timetable. How many timetables does the MBTA have per year? Yeah, 4. So you're making these decisions running up to each timetable, the start of each timetable period. And the main decisions are the staff, and you sort of got your workforce fixed, and you're deciding how to allocate them across depots or garages or rail lines, and by days of the week. Those are the tactical level decisions you're making. Those, it turns out, are actually quite important. If you make poor decisions, then you're going to be providing less reliable service or more expensive service than you otherwise would. And then at the final level, your operational level is, here we are, 4 o'clock on a Thursday. At 12 o'clock today, so 4 hours ago, the MBTA was deciding when to ask each extra board operator to show up for work tomorrow if they didn't have a guaranteed assignment. Okay? So there are unexpected absences that will occur tomorrow. You don't know when they're going to occur. You don't know whether it's going to be an AM report or a PM report or whatever it is. And you have to make the decision about when, if you have 5 extra board operators that don't have an assignment because of known and advance absence, when do you want them to show up? And that, the daily report times for unassigned extra staff is the operational level decision. Any questions about this in terms of strategic, operational, tactical? And I'm not talking here about things, policies that may change absenteeism, for instance. Fred will talk about some of those next week when he talks about labor relations. But I'm talking about sort of a narrower piece of this puzzle. Any questions on this? Yes, Kenji.
Who become the part-time operator?
Yeah.
So are they required any license or?
Oh yes, commercial driver's license is required for them. But again, what I was saying is you have choice about both who to recruit into those positions. You know, do we want an AM part-timer or a split shift, full-day part-timer who's going to be unhappy until they get to the full-time position at the MBTA that they really want? So, yeah, sorry. The other point I wanted to make is that how you select those people who will get promoted to full-timers. So you've decided through attrition, the full-time ranks, you want to promote some part-timers. How do you make that promotion? Do you promote based strictly on seniority? In other words, the first one to become a part-timer becomes the first one to be promoted to a full-timer? Probably not, because you'd really like people who are motivated, who have a good absence record, a good accident record. So you'd like to use criteria in that promotion which are more than just strict seniority. And the MBTA, again, has been, I would say, not very effective in using that balance between seniority, which is an important issue. You want to avoid favoritism and discrimination in the promotion process, with having some elements of performance in the promotion process, I would argue. So those are some of the... Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was interested in the topic because, yeah, we have a similar culture for the station staff.
Yes.
In Japan, but for driver,
Yes.
they require very strict license,
Right.
which takes a long time to take. So we don't have any part-time driver.
Right. Right. Yes. And you know, there are commercial driver's license is required for the MBTA. A bus driver or a train driver has to have a commercial driver's license, but it's not as rigorous on a long period of qualification as it is, I'm sure, in JR East. That would be my guess anyway. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Okay, so let's look at this as 3 levels of planning. So strategic level, we're deciding the workforce size, vacation allocation over the year, and hiring patterns over the course of the year. So by period of the year, the input into this includes absence hours. If we know we typically have more absence hours in the winter because the conditions are miserable, you don't want to drive in snow and ice, and if you have observed higher absence rates, that's important in making the right decisions on the strategic level. Required extra work. If we know that we are going to be busing on the Braintree branch of the Red Line because of reconstruction, then we'll build that into our workforce planning thing. So that's an example of required extra work. And attrition. We do projections about the number of full-timers and part-timers who will be retiring or leaving the productive workforce over the next year. On the right-hand side, we have inputs such as budget, the service plan, the operations plan, vacation liability, how much vacation do we have to provide in the next year, work rules and policies that we want to meet. And what I'm showing here is strategic level, tactical level, and operational level. So, and what you'll see is these downward arrows from strategy to tactics to operations, and the upward pointing arrows back up the chain from operations to tactical to strategic. So let's explain each of these arrows. The downward arrows represent constraints on your decisions. So if you've made some strategic level decisions on workforce size, that limits what you can do at the tactical level. And that's this downward arrow here. Similarly, you make your tactical level decisions at the beginning of a timetable, that limits what you can do at the operational level. These are these downward pointing arrows between these boxes. The upward pointing arrows are the relationships between that you need to know about how efficiently the operations level is conducted to make good decisions at the higher levels of the planning hierarchy. So, for instance, if you know that overtime is virtually impossible to get from your workforce for whatever reason, they may say, I'm just not going to cooperate, I'm not going to work, there could be, bad or good reasons for that, then you need to know that in order to make the right decisions at the tactical level. And similarly, you need to know that to make the right decisions at the strategic level. So these are these upward pointing arrows here. And the difference in the inputs are just more detail. So absence hours by garage and by day of week is important input into the tactical level. Absence hours by garage and time of day is important input into the operational level. Okay? And you have work rules and policies as critical inputs on all these levels. So this is a slightly different look at these relationships. And I want to lead you through this a little bit. So this is our strategic planning box where we're deciding workforce size. What goes into this, the unit costs, how much does it cost to provide a platform hour, which is an hour of driving a bus, by an overtime employee, a full-time employee, and a part-time employee? Those are very important basic cost units that we need to have. What's the budget and what are the work rules? The work rules are important because they tell us how easy it will be to do certain things. And I'll give you examples of that later on. And of course, you have the scheduled hours, which comes out of your operations plan, the timetable requirements. So given that you've made a decision on the workforce size at the strategic level, on a particular day, you may have an amount of open work. What do I mean by open work? It's work that we want to deliver, but there's no one obvious to provide it. There's no one, so we'll try and buy time on an overtime basis. So we're down here, and if we're lucky, the overtime, there'll be someone available who's willing to work the overtime for increased pay. The negative side of that is it increases the strain on that employee who's working more hours than he or she was expecting to. That may produce this negative feedback on absence. And I described it previously as the trade-off between how much do I have to work to get to a certain target income level. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But the other way of looking at it, which is equally realistic, is if you're working harder, that puts more stress and strain on the body, you're more likely to be absent. Because there are two ways of looking at it, which both raise the concern about relying heavily on overtime and what that will do to absence. Again, over here, if you can't get the overtime, you're going to be dropping trips, so reliability suffers, negative effect on service reliability, service quality. Presumably that will affect ridership if it goes on long enough, and that will affect your operating plan because your ridership's down, and so there's that feedback as well. So this is sort of another way of looking at the framework. Now let's look at the strategic level in terms of the planning process. What I've shown here is a month, as was said, 4 seasons in the MBTA. Some agencies have more, some have less. Winter, spring, summer, and fall. And let's have a hypothetical workforce hiring scenario where we hire up at the beginning of each timetable. We sort of run through the timetable, and then we hire up for the beginning of the next timetable. That's sort of a hypothetical. That's not unusual, but it's not a very effective way of doing it. And what I've tried to explain here is why that is the case. So the bottom bar in this graph indicates the timetable requirements. So typically the timetable requirements for the operating plan are pretty similar across winter, spring, and fall, and they're lower in the summer. Why is that? No schools, and people are on vacation, so your demand is generally down, unless it's a very strong summer tourist place like Boston. So that generally means that you can reduce your operating plan requirements in the summer. That is wonderful. Why? Because many drivers would like to take vacation in the summer. Okay? They want to be, unless you're a serious outdoor skier, ice skater, whatever have you in the winter, you probably don't want to take vacation in the winter because your children are still in school. You really perhaps want to go on family vacations when the weather is decent. So this enables you, this cross-hatched area here is the vacation allocation you've made to fulfill your vacation liability over the year. And so what you see here is we're providing much more vacation in the summer than we are in the winter or even in the spring and the autumn. Why? That's because our demand is down, but the vacation demand is up. So that's a way of minimizing absenteeism. Makes our workforce happy. It's a good thing. So this gives us this profile here about the number of people we need to cover the work and cover the vacations. So the only thing we haven't covered is the absence. And we have to cover the absence as well, because those people aren't there to work that particular day. So typically, if you did this, you hire up at the beginning of each timetable model that I talked about, what you'd have is something like this in terms of the extra board coverage, sort of a constant level throughout this, except at the end, and the end of the timetable is higher because people have made changes in routes, there's retraining, there's training of new operators. So actually your required work is greatest at the end of the timetable in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So that's what this jump here is in terms of the required work. However, look at the supply. Typically what happens is you have attrition over the course of the timetable, and you have increasing absenteeism over the course of the timetable. Why? Because at the beginning of the timetable, people have just picked that work. They sort of want to do it. The grass is always greener. They're sort of enthusiastic at the beginning of the timetable. They get out there and they realize it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And so when they're not feeling up to it, they're more likely to be absent, perhaps, as time wears along. And then towards the end, they've made their new selection of work for the following timetable. Okay? So what this suggests is you have a surplus of operators available at the beginning of the timetable and a significant deficit of operators at the end of the timetable. So you sort of have one day in the middle of the timetable which is perfect. But otherwise, you're off. You haven't got this good balance between the operators that you have available and what you need. So clearly doing workforce hiring every month, for instance, is one way of dealing with this. So you can hire up, you can reduce this hump for training new operators and spread it over the whole period, because in round terms, training for an operator takes about a month of on-the-road training, and so you spread that over the month, over the timetable. So going to monthly hiring makes a lot of sense. And again, you avoid these problems having unassigned cover time. What that means is you got people who are being paid not to be very productive in the garage. You haven't got very, very good things for them to do, because otherwise you'd build it into the operating plan. And large amounts of overtime and unreliability at the end of the timetable. And I don't know what your experience is, but in my experience, that's exactly what you see. At the end of a timetable, service goes down the tubes, because you get this imbalance between higher absence and higher requirements for running into the next timetable. So you want to try and avoid that. Okay, so let's look at this from a total cost perspective. This is a very simple sketch. I'll show you something more realistic in a few minutes, but this is the conceptual part of this. So on the x-axis, and I apologize, this is a typo, that's number of extra board. The extra board is the cover list, the people who are there to cover absences or do extra work that's required, not built into the timetable. These are extra boards or cover lists, whatever. And that should be the number of drivers, extra board operators, not extra board operations. And on the y-axis, you have the cost. So if you have a small number of extra board operators, your fringe benefit costs are low. They will increase as your fixed fringe benefit costs will increase as you increase the number. But you'll be relying very heavily on overtime. So you'll be having high direct payment costs because of the reliance on overtime, and that gives you an overall high-cost solution. Beyond some point where you get a good balance between the costs of overtime and the costs of fixed fringe benefits, then you'll get a sweet spot you want to try and operate. And you want to avoid this, where you've got so many operators that there are a lot of people who don't have a lot of work to do on many days. This is, yes, question, comment.
It's a question.
Okay.
I didn't quite understand why monthly hiring will reduce the time.
Okay.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it will first and foremost take care of this hump at the end of the time. Sorry, yeah, thanks, Gabrielle, for reminding me. It will take care of this hump at the end of the timetable. If there really is an extra requirement for work at the end of the timetable, you can hire up for that a month before. So if you think of this as a sawtooth pattern, okay, which is what it is, you've got attrition and then you've got a bulk hiring. If you reduce the periodicity of the saws, the gaps, you'll reduce the imbalance, the integrated imbalance between the requirements and what you need. So that's in essence what's going on here. Thanks, good question. Okay, so this is sort of the classic schema for analyzing this problem, for modeling it. So here on the x-axis, we have number of scheduled runs. This is for an organization that sort of looks a lot like the MBTA. And it would be this histogram here is the cumulative distribution for number of absence days in the previous period. Okay? So now we're running into the summer timetable for the MBTA. So when the MBTA was doing the analysis on this, they were saying, well, what level of absence can we expect this coming summer? Well, we'll start by looking at last summer. That's probably a fairly good proxy for what we can expect this summer. And so the way they would look at that is look at the number of absent operators by day of week over the full range of experiences from last summer. So on your best day last summer for the MBTA, these are hypothetical numbers, but I want to give you the flavor of this, you had 16 absences. 16 drivers didn't show up for work for whatever reason. On your worst day, you had 60 operators who didn't show up for work that day. So it's a tremendous range. Question?
Sorry.
Yeah.
They have a charter, so
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I'm trying to do a lot in one chart here. So this, if we look at that, it's the cumulative distribution of absence days. It's sort of the so. This is the percent of days which have absences less than this number. So it's a cumulative distribution, cumulative density function. So what we're saying here is that every day had no more than 60 operators absent. Every day had at least 16 operators absent. And this is the historical record of absences over that period. Now, the reason I've drawn this line here is to show you what the extra board sizing trade-off is. So we're looking at, say, 31 extra board operators here. If we have 31 extra board operators, and we assume there's no absence in the extra board operators, of course there will be, then we will be able to cover all of the absences in Area B without paying any overtime. But all of the absences on days in Area A, we'll have to pay overtime for, and we'll have to deal with reliability drop trips on those days. So the first point I want to make is this is a very simple model, but it's very useful. It provides a lot of insight into how you make these decisions. The first point to make is, my God, that's a lot of variability. From 16 to 60 operators absent on different days of the timetable. So probably some of that is systematic. So some of them, probably you have maybe higher absence on Mondays and Fridays than you have on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So you probably want to do this analysis at the day of week level. Okay? Maybe you can group Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays. Maybe you can group Mondays and Fridays. But the principles are the same. So there are different ways of classifying days to reduce the variance. But you're basically going to have this sort of trade-off between your sort of deterministic number from this cumulative density function, cumulative distribution. Is everyone comfortable with this? Because this is important. Yeah.
Just curious about so this we're obviously talking about public transportation here, but
yeah.
I'm thinking of delivery companies might
yeah.
be very similar.
Yes.
Yeah. Consulted by them for this type of work?
I don't personally, but the problems are very similar. And the airlines have very similar problems. I was on a trip not too long ago where I was delayed at Logan Airport for an hour because they had an unexpected absence. Their reserve crew member happened to live in Nashua, New Hampshire, which a lot of airline pilots live in because it doesn't have any taxes in that state. And they had to drive down in the peak hour to get to the plane. I was delayed for an hour. So that's so every industry has the same sort of problem when it's a transportation industry where the shelf life, you don't have a shelf life. It's not a production process, it's a service, and you have to deliver it at that time in that location. So there are similar problems. Again, it's not totally dissimilar from staffing in hospitals for nurses, for doctors, everything like that. So there's a whole class of problems here which are quite similar. And I'm just presenting the particular variant of this for the transit industry. Other questions or comments on this? Yeah.
Is mislabeled here? Should it drivers not schedule this?
Sorry. No. These it could be mislabeled. what I'm trying to say is these are the number of scheduled operators who are absent on that day. That's what it really means. Okay?
Runs for which the scheduled operator.
Yeah. So the analysis is the sort of full day for a full timer. That's sort of the unit. And you can label the x-axis in different ways, and this probably isn't the best possible label, but that's what I'm getting at. Okay? Other questions or comments? Okay, so let's quickly look at the strategic level model here. Decision variables are, what we're trying to decide is the workforce size for each period. And typically, as I said, maybe the period is a month, 4 weeks. And the vacation allocation for each period, and the vacation allocation would typically be over the course of a timetable. So what's the average number of vacation weeks we want to provide in the summer at a particular garage or across the whole system? We'll provide the same number of vacation weeks for all the bus system in the MBTA, and someone who's on covering the vacation just is covering the different vacations every week of the timetable. So you have to have the same number throughout the timetable. Okay? And the optimal hiring level, so you get the right number throughout the year. That's sort of what we're trying to achieve here. And the objective is to minimize the workforce cost, which includes the costs of the scheduled runs, the costs of the extra board, the people who are there to cover the absences and the extra work, and the cost of overtime. And you'll notice there that I didn't include costs of reliability or unreliability because I'm including that in the constraint. I could have included it in the objective function, but I'm including it in the constraint just because it's a little bit easier to conceptualize it that way. And we were doing this work for the MBTA, who kind of like to think of overtime as a constraint, because overtime, as you're probably aware, gets a lot of attention in the media, in the press. 10% of our budget is being spent on overtime for drivers. Those are headline sorts of issues. So the MBTA and transit agencies generally are sensitive to the level of overtime. That's why I structured this as a constraint rather than as a multi-objective function, term and multiple objectives. Constraints we need to meet: vacation liability, overtime, service reliability, part-time operator constraints, and any other policy constraints that we want to can be included in this optimization problem. And the reliability model that we have is basically this. So what this is saying is we have open work. What open work means is we have work we want to do. We don't have anyone who's going to be willing to do it without paying overtime. That's what I mean by open work. It's work that there isn't a regularly scheduled employee available to cover. So overtime is available. If an operator is available and willing to work overtime, you come down here and overtime is worked. That may produce more absence, may have those negative feedback effects, but at least you've delivered the service that day. If there's no operator available or there's no operator willing to work the overtime, you drop the trips and you've got a reliability problem on your hands. This is don't worry about the individual points there, but this is showing for the MBTA, for the bus network on the MBTA, on the x-axis, the open work. This is for a particular timetable, system-wide for the bus, and the number of missed trip hours that were incurred that day. So each point here represents a day of operation on the MBTA bus system. And so this particular day, you had close to 300 hours of open work, and you dropped close to 150 hours of service. And if you do an OLS regression on this, this was the best fit we got. So that means for every 100 hours of open work at the time we did this analysis that you wanted to get, you were only able to get 72, and you wound up dropping 28 hours of service. That is pretty tough. That's actually really quite bad. By comparison purposes, I've done other work in Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, which are pretty good, more or less East Coast properties in Canada, and they're never more than 10%. So there's something not being done very efficiently in the way the MBTA covers their overtime. And I think part of this is probably over-reliance on seniority, again, and probably not doing enough advanced planning and making too many efforts to contact. What do I mean by not relying too much on, by relying too heavily on seniority? How many phone calls do you make to the most senior operator who might be available before you say, he or she isn't going to do this work, and you go to the next person on the list? And how much advanced planning do you do to make sure that you've got a set of operators who are really going to be available if you have a need for them at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning? Those are the things that you can do to try and reduce this 28% missed trips to 5 or 10% missed trips, which would be a much better situation for everyone concerned. So this is the MBTA case study. Again, bear in mind that this was basically mid-1990s, so it's 20 years ago. But also, believe me, nothing much has changed in this regard with the MBTA. I'm not saying nothing's changed with the MBTA in any regard over the last 20 years, but certainly in this regard, nothing much has changed. And I think there are still some of the same problems that I'll talk about here still in existence, which is sad for me to admit because obviously I was trying to help them and didn't succeed. So at that point, the part-time workforce was sized to about 40% of the full-time workforce. That's a little bit lower now, I believe. There's a large variability in required work hours. So what do I mean by that? The mean daily absence and extra work required, this is apart from the timetable. So this is shuttling service when you get a line down for signaling problem or disabled train or whatever it is, or fatality on the tracks. The mean daily absence and extra work for the whole MBTA bus system was 1,250 hours on a daily basis. And the standard deviation of that was 290 hours.
What percentage is that of the total hours?
It's coming up. It's in the order of, I'll get into it in a few minutes, but it's round figures 10%. Wow. It's pretty high. That's not just absence. It doesn't include extra work. Okay?
And it does include like sick leave as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Any kind of absence?
Yes, any sort of absence, exactly. So it's not, in any sense, absenteeism. It's the amount of extra work you have to do beyond what's the scheduled operating plan. But anyway, it's it's quite large and it's very variable. So it is highly stochastic. Now, these figures were from 1996, and so the numbers will have changed significantly over the last 20 years, but the relative ratio of the numbers in the different columns and cells has not changed significantly in the last 20 years. So what this is saying, what we're showing here is the cost per platform, the driver cost per platform hour. And so this includes the wage rate and benefits, fixed and variable fringe benefits. So an hour of overtime worked by a driver at that time was around $30 an hour. This is the first row is the wage rate. The second row is the full cost. So the difference here is the benefits that are included in and the productivity changes between overtime, part-time, and full-timers. So for overtime, you get a very small benefit load because most of the benefits are covered through their base job. Okay, so the marginal cost of overtime work in terms of benefit load is quite small, in the order of less than 10%, or just about 10% of this. Whereas for part-timers and full-timers, get somewhat greater benefits, so it's a significant increment. So if you just scan across here, this gives you the straight, direct comparison between the cost of an hour of work produced on an overtime basis by a full-timer or by a part-timer. And in round terms, you say, well, if it's 40% part-timer, 60% full-timer as the mix of workforce versus 32/72 for an overtime, it's a wash. It's basically the same. Okay? So strictly in terms of cost, it doesn't really matter. It matters a lot if you have far too many people, but it doesn't matter too much in terms of the cost if you have about the right number or slightly less than that number. If you have a lot less than that number, the short-run cost, financial cost won't change, but you'll have reliability problems because you won't be able to get the overtime. However, what we really should be looking at is the marginal cost of the last person on the cover list. That's where we're making the marginal decision about whether we want to increase the cover list by 1 or decrease it by 1 or hold it where it is. So if the last person on the cover list is being used 50% of the time, then you're making a trade-off between $32.72 for an overtime hour versus $69.56 for the marginal person on the cover list. So, okay, so what a critical issue is, in terms of any of you guys doing analysis for a transit agency, be it JR East or the MBTA or whatever it is, in this area, you really want to look at what the distribution of the costs are of the cover list. And a good proxy for that is who's picking the work on the cover list. If it's the most senior operators who are picking the work on the cover list, that means that's pretty easy work. If the senior operators are not picking the cover list and it's being left to the junior people on the seniority list, that means the senior operators want to avoid it because it's difficult work. So that's a very simple shortcut. Do we have an oversized cover list or an undersized cover list? Look at who's picking that work on the cover list. Is it very senior operators or not? Any questions on this?
So cover list, are those people who come in and they're sort of waiting to go out?
Yeah.
Not people who are sitting at home waiting for phone.
No. They're in the garage. Maybe playing cards in the garage, but they're in the garage and they're available. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the model. Again, I'm happy to give you the papers and theses on this. One of these theses was done by Haris Koutsopoulos, who many of you know quite well, who's a senior faculty member at Northeastern. Another of the papers' theses was done by Yoram Shiftan, who was entertaining me in Israel just 3 days ago. So there's some very good work that's been done on this. But the model that came out of this is, I'm going to show you some results and talk about what they mean. What this is showing is, under different scenarios, the number of full-time operators, the number of part-time operators that produce the optimal solution, the overtime as a percent of the full cost. The full cost, $96.4 million in this case per year. That's the regular cost. Regular time cost is the overtime cost. You add them up and you get the total cost, 97.8 here. And this is adding different constraints. So the base case, without any constraints beyond vacational liability, the things that we've already talked about, are that the cost of the MBTA bus drivers should be about 98 million. These are $1996 again, about $98 million. And the reliability, given 1.5% of the time has to be worked on overtime, and given the way they manage their overtime, which is not very good, not very well, they'll be dropping about 4%, 0.4% of the trips, 4 trips out of every 1,000. That was their existing level of unreliability in terms of dropping service. So that's the base case numbers. You could then add different constraints. If you add a constant hiring constraint, which means that we hire the same number of operators every month over the course of a year, and we don't allow it to vary from month to month, what does that do? It makes it easier for the human resources folks. It makes it easier for the training people because they know what their load is going to be throughout the year. And in fact, you can incorporate that single constraint with zero impact on the budget or reliability. So the solution is exactly the same. We've just juggled vacation liability between different periods. Okay? If we wanted to have a constant vacation as a policy in the organization, we add that as a constraint, so the same amount of vacation throughout the year, then that would result in about a almost $2 million increase in the total cost of the MBTA bus drivers. We'd have less overtime, and so our reliability would improve to dropping 2 trips out of every 1,000 rather than 4 trips out of every 1,000. And if we included them both, the constant hiring and vacation, which I don't think you'd want to, but this is just to show what you can do with this sort of model, then that would increase the budget by an additional $1.5 million a year. And because you'd be relying less on overtime, you'd be having even more reliable service. So it gives the MBTA managers a sense of the trade-offs here, but between the size of the workforce, optimally structured over the course of the year, and reliability and overtime. One different set of results here. This is showing, okay, so what happens if we change the level of the overtime constraint? So the base case here is 1.5% overtime as a constraint. If we just eliminated the overtime constraint completely and said, just choose the amount of overtime that gives you the minimal cost solution, then your overtime cost would be close to $12 million a year, and that would enable you to save about $1.3 million per year on the overall budget because of the relative cost of overtime versus regular work. However, your reliability would go to hell in a handbasket, and you'd be dropping 3 trips out of every 100, 3 hours of service out of every 100, and probably this is much better than it would really be if you did that, because this is not a linear function. Okay? You're going to have more and more trouble covering those trips and getting people to agree to work overtime if there's so much overtime being asked of the workforce. So this is a gross underestimate. But if you looked at 5%, which is still pretty high, then it would you'd save, in theory, about $800,000 a year, less than $1 million a year, and your reliability would decrease significantly from dropping 4 trips out of every 1,000 to dropping 120 trips out of every 1,000. 12. From 4 to 12. And then if you tighten the overtime constraint for whatever reason, then this is what it would cost you. It would cost you about $500,000 a year. And again, you get some improvement in reliability. So these are the sort of uses of the model that you can use to inform management decisions about how you structure your hiring process and training process and extra board size. Okay, that's all I want to say on the strategic level. Any questions? Yes.
Do you have a sense of how difficult it is or how costly it is to hire additional new drivers?
Yes. So there is a training period. the MBTA, since Fred was secretary, has had a lottery process for selection of new employees, and every agency, including the MBTA, has a pretty rigorous testing procedure you have to go through to get to the point of being hired. You then go through training, the criminal records check, all sorts of checks before the training begins. And then the training, I'm trying to remember, I don't have it on the top of my head. I think the total training is in the order of 6 weeks, so, which includes getting your commercial driver's license, as we talked about earlier. So you've got a certain amount of advanced planning in here. You can't decide today, I want to have a lot of people, more people on the driver workforce tomorrow. It's not going to work. So that's why you need to have a strategic view of this. Yes?
Does this model capture the behavioral feedback loop that you
It does not. So that was separate work. And we did look at that, but it's not in the results I presented. So as I said, Yoram Shiftan looked at the feedback effect between if you provide more overtime, what does that do to absence? And what he found was it's variable. For some operators, there is a feedback effect, but it's not as strong as you might expect. Okay? So the MBTA management, for instance, was pretty convinced this was really a serious issue. It wasn't in our analysis, but there is a feedback effect. It's not reflected in here. Yes, Scott?
Earlier you said you look at the seniority of the extra boards
Yes.
that are taking work from the cover list.
Yes.
And use that as a proxy of
Yes.
whether the work is desirable. Or
Yes.
the more senior person takes it, the work is
Yes.
desirable.
Yes.
And what's the, I didn't quite get the implication there for the amount.
Okay, so yeah, so if the most senior operators are picking, can pick anything, are picking the extra board, that means you don't have to work very hard on the extra board. The extra board is probably too large. Okay, it's the simple proxy. Similarly, if the most senior operators are picking certain duties in a garage over, in terms of the types of shifts and the days they work, that's a good proxy for what's easy, what's not so easy. That's not to say senior operators aren't highly motivated. They are, but they also have their own self-interest at heart. They don't necessarily want to be on a dangerous, difficult route to operate. Now, the problem here, which Fred will get into, I think, next week, in terms of the way the U.S. transit industry operates, there are lots of problems, but one of the problems in terms of the way the U.S. transit industry operates compared with European industry is they rely very heavily on seniority. So what does that mean? It means the least capable drivers, who are the people who are new in the job and haven't got a lot of experience, have the most difficult assignments. That's almost certainly not optimal. So it means you have very poor drivers in terms of not their capability, but where they are on the learning curve, driving very difficult routes. And the the European approach to this is typically to have a rotating roster. Okay? So you don't, in the US transit industry, one of the main benefits of more seniority for a particular individual is you get to pick your work and you get to pick your vacation time. So, if you get to 10 years at the MBTA, perhaps you never have to work weekends unless you particularly want to, which you often won't. Whereas in most European systems, they have, you're assigned to a roster that rotates. So you will all go through the same experience over the course of 2 months. I don't know how JR East does it, Kenji. Similar to Europe. That's really the dominant model elsewhere that I'm familiar with. There are trade-offs in this. So one of the trade-offs is that if you use that as your main motivation for keeping people on the workforce, you want to keep your good operators working, you don't want to have to replace them, you can either pay a wage rate incentive for longevity, which is more common in other agencies around the world, but it's not very common in the US. And so you progress from the minimum, the entry-level wage in the MBTA to the top level in about 2 years. Okay, and that's not unusual in the US transit industry. And so because that is such a minimal incentive to hang around for 20 years, you want to provide other incentives, and so seniority, picking your work, picking your vacation, is the way the US transit industry has followed this. Gabrielle, you're going to make a comment.
It's a half comment, half question.
Yeah.
When we discussed crew scheduling, we briefly touched on rostering and
Yes.
differences between North American and European practice.
Yes.
And part of that was that in European practice, rostering is done sometimes with some help of OR or algorithms
Yes.
to
Yes.
make the different rosters as even as possible.
Right.
And that is slightly different from picking them. So
Yes.
right, so in North America, these rosters are formed by people, and they assemble the rosters from the crew schedules. Is that correct?
Well, the roster, as I'm describing the roster, is the rotation, if any, of the work that's done among individuals over the course of a period, maybe a timetable or 2 months. If you have a rotating roster, that means everyone in this group goes through the same set of driving responsibilities over the course of a 2-month period or a timetable. In the US transit industry case, you don't have any rotation. You don't even have a roster. So you're there, you do the same trip every day if you show up. If you don't show up for work, you don't do the duty. So it's a trade-off. I personally don't, maybe it's my European roots, I kind of tend to prefer the European approach to this than the US approach to this. Okay, let me quickly jump into the tactical level. So here we're going into the summer timetable at the MBTA in about a month's time. And so we'll be deciding, we know how many drivers we have on the property. What we're deciding now is when to assign the work on a daily basis and how many operators to provide to Lynn versus Quincy versus Arbor Way versus Cabot, the different depots in the system. And again, so we're allocating the extra staff, these floaters, by garage and by day of week. And so we want to know the absence level on a more detailed basis here. We have basically the same sort of issues and concerns, just at a more detailed level of analysis. And we can either use a heuristic or optimization for this. And heuristics actually give you a very good solution because it's much simpler. This is real data from the MBTA, again, from 20 years ago. So I'm not saying it's exactly the same today, but I would bet it's not that different from now than what it was then. So this is a single MBTA garage. This is the Cabot garage, which is one of the biggest MBTA bus garages. And this, for that garage, this shows the mean open work, number of open hours of work on a daily basis over a timetable. So on Mondays, 259 hours was the mean number of hours you had to cover because you didn't have someone available. Standard deviation of that was 36. So that's quite variable. Tuesday and Wednesday is lower in terms of absences, also quite variable. Thursday and particularly Friday is much higher and also even more variable. So following our analysis principles, the cumulative density function, then you would expect to want to allocate your workforce, your spare workforce, reflecting the level of absence. But no. The MBTA was allocating their extra board exactly equally across all days, all weekdays. 20 extra board operators on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, lower levels on Saturday and Sunday, but the same percentage, independent of the observed level of difference in absence or extra work required on those days. the model showed that if you optimally reallocated the same level of resources, basically the same level down here in terms of operated days, you provide more cover on Fridays, on Mondays, and at weekends, and less coverage on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, reflecting the absence patterns. That's optimizing at the daily level for a particular garage. So, and at that point, they weren't using part-timers. They were using part-timers, but it wasn't. They weren't. The part-timers were not on the extra board and not being used in quite the same way that they are now. So, and what you get out of this is the expected overtime hours over the whole timetable, recognizing the variability on a particular day, is the expected level of overtime hours is over the whole week is 140 hours versus 99 hours. So you're saving about 25 to 30% of your overtime costs just by reallocating your existing workforce more effectively across days of the week. This is not rocket science. This is actually pretty easy to do. I mean, you can get these absence figures quite easily and implement them. So the tactical level findings are significant variation in absence and required extra work by garage and by day of week. So what would you expect by garage in terms of absence rates? You might expect, and you'd be right, that the most difficult garages would have the highest absence rates. Those are tough conditions. So if you look at Cabot, those are very tough routes. And so when you do a system-wide pick, that allows the operators to select the garage they work at. So the most senior operators will avoid Cabot. So it's the most junior operators that wind up at Cabot on the most difficult routes. Not a great surprise, your absence rate is higher at Cabot than it is at Lynn or Quincy. Nice, comfortable suburban garages. So, yeah.
How do you define a difficult route?
Right.
Oh, okay. So there can be any number of things. Very heavy traffic, danger of accidents, danger of assault, crime, danger of altercations among customers, passengers on the bus, altercations with the driver. So a number of things like that. And so, I'm not saying all the routes in the Lynn garage are great routes, but compared with operating in the inner city, which is where the Cabot routes typically serve, there is a difference. And certainly in Quincy, there'll be a big difference as well, yes.
So the workforce would have different levels of information about which route or which garage would be more difficult.
By word of mouth. It's not a sort of a conscious campaign. The idea is basically you say, hey, we've got a seniority system, so you'll get to know other operators at different depots, word of mouth, and you'll select based on what's available when it gets to you and your place on your seniority list where you want to work. And often it's based on where you live. You don't have to commute from Lynn to Quincy every day to do your work. So it's a question of proximity to where you live and the ease, the comfort level you'll have on the routes and the conditions that you'll be operating on. Okay? And the policy of the MBTA at this point was to provide the same level of cover at every garage. Why? Their argument that they articulated to me, and obviously I discussed this with them extensively, they would not dispute the fact that Cabot has a higher level of absence than Quincy or Lynn. That they accept that. That's not in dispute. But their argument would be, you're rewarding the manager of Cabot by giving them more manpower if you recognize the existing absence level. So they're concerned about this feedback loop. If you have more absence, you get more manpower. to me, that's a completely backwards way of thinking about this. You need to have incentives for the managers to do a good job, hopefully, but you shouldn't let that be the motivation for making bad decisions about how you use your resources, which is basically what's happening here. And they were arguing the same thing in terms of day of week as well. So they were really fighting that concept, and I wasn't successful in persuading them that they should really separate out the management incentives from the efficiency of the decisions they're making. Okay. All right, the final level, I've got a few minutes left, is the operational level. So again, we've gone from the 1-year time planning horizon to the timetable planning horizon for 3 or 4 months, now down to the daily level. Okay. So the objective here is pretty much the same thing. We're trying to minimize the weighted sum of overtime and missed trips. And decision variables are, I'm sorry, I'm still at the operational level here. This is right, sorry. So what we want to do here is decide the report times for any unassigned extra staff for the next day. So as I said, at 12 o'clock today, if there were 5 operators who had not been assigned work for tomorrow at Cabot, then the MBTA manager, desk superintendent, or whoever you want to call him or her, at Cabot will be posting the report times for those 5 people tomorrow. You don't know when the absence is going to be. You didn't have any known in advance absence to give them work to cover, but you want them to be available so that when you do get the absences which you don't know about, they'll be in a good position to cover them. And so this gets into the most detailed level of this. So it's not just a question of having the right number of drivers available on a particular day. It's a question of having the right number of available drivers at every time of that day. That's the problem we're dealing with here. So again, much more uncertainty about how the absence is at 9 o'clock a.m. versus 5 o'clock p.m. And what this is showing is this glorious concept. It used to be called slop overtime. The MBTA didn't like the term slop overtime, so it's now excess overtime. So you have regular overtime, which is just you didn't have enough personnel on the payroll, and so you had to buy overtime if you're going to deliver the service. Excess overtime is where, in theory, you have enough people to cover the needs, but they're not available when you want them to be, because you couldn't make perfect decisions about when they should show up to make sure they're productive. So here I'm showing, here this is time of day from 5 a.m. to 1 a.m. the next morning. This shows the open run profile, okay, like that. Sorry, this is the open run profile like this. And this is the available cover profile based on your report time decisions, like this. And so what this shows is that you have these periods here and here and here where you had more operators available than you had work to cover. And so that means that there were other periods of the day here and here and here where you didn't have enough operators. You had the right number on the whole day, you just didn't have them at the right time in the day. And it's not just you made bad decisions, it's that this is stochastic. You can't make perfect decisions. So you've got to expect there's going to be some excess overtime built in here. And this is the excess overtime curve, and I will wrap this up in 4 minutes, I promise. I may not go through everything, but I'll cover most of what we want. So this, on the x-axis, is the available cover minus the required cover. So again, if it's a perfect balance excess cover minus required cover is 0, because you had a perfect fit. But what that gives you is the greatest number of excess overtime hours, because unless you made every decision perfectly, you're going to have excess overtime hours. If you go way out here, you had far more people available than you needed. So you shouldn't have any excess overtime, even if you make lousy decisions. You put them out any time, they'll be covered. And you put them out, if you have far fewer people available than you require, you'll be out here, and you shouldn't have any excess overtime either, because you don't have to be very good to make decisions which will have these people be fully employed. Okay? So it's when you have this exact balance, you have to make every decision perfectly to avoid excess overtime, and you're never going to do that. Okay, so I got some results here, which you can go through on your own, and I don't think I need to cover this specifically. But what this, let me get to the conclusion on this. What this shows is the analysis we did on this level of the model shows, because of the natural peaking in work requirements, that you have much more service in the peak than in the middle of the day, the base, it doesn't matter that absence rates are actually higher in the peak than they are in the middle of the day, because your decisions are driven by the same underlying dynamic. And so you just can make good report time decisions based on the average absence rate on that day at that depot. So you don't have to go into super detailed analysis, which is good news. And in fact, you can wind up with having a ranked list of report times that the desk manager at Cabot can just work off that list for tomorrow based on the number of unassigned cover operators you have, and it will always give you a good solution, as opposed to the desk manager making decisions de novo every day. This is a very simple decision support tool that can help. So the operational level findings, significant improvements are possible, can reduce the overtime and missed trips, and a single set of report times can be used across all weekdays and seasons for each garage. Separate ranked report times for Saturdays and Sundays, and constant absence rates can be assumed by hour of day and day of week. Those are the main conclusions. Okay, sorry I raced towards the end, but I'm available. I am retiring, as Gabrielle well knows, at the end of the summer. This is probably my last lecture as a non-retired MIT faculty member. It's been fun doing it with you, and I'm around, and I will be around after the end of the summer as well. Just I won't be being paid by MIT. So if anyone wants to discuss any of this or go through any of the background topics, please feel free to come see me. Okay? Thanks very much.